Some people, Ika, some people are saying in the chat that they can't see anything. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this historic session during Black History Month 2021, sort of history making in and of itself. We hope that you leave with enhanced knowledge and perspective in order to aid your decision making on vaccines, those of you who haven't decided whether or not you take a vaccine. So it's a pleasure for all of us to be here this afternoon, and I know it's a particular pleasure for Councillor Joe Cressy, who is here to bring greetings from the City of Toronto and from Mayor John Tory. Councillor, I'm turning it over to you.
Well, thank you, Akwatu, and let me begin by thanking members of the Black Scientists Task Force, many of whom are here today, for your time and your commitment. Members of City of Toronto staff, a number of whom are here, who are working, well, today is a Saturday, but they're working every day. But most especially to everybody who's joining in your living rooms and dining rooms and family rooms. It's good to be here with you. I think we all need to start with the fact that COVID-19 has not been the great equalizer. The hard truth is that COVID-19 has exposed and in fact exacerbated so many pre-existing inequities, both in our city, in our province, and in our country. You know, in Toronto, last spring, we began collecting disaggregated data based on race, on income, on housing and occupation. And the data, it was clear, and frankly, it was a punch to the gut, because half of the cases in the City of Toronto of COVID have been people on lower incomes. 79% of all cases of COVID in our city have been racialized Torontonians. And Black Torontonians, members of our Black communities, despite being only 9% of the city's population, have been at any given time anywhere between 16 and 32% of all cases, and currently 24% of all hospitalizations. That's brutal. I mean, there's no other way to say it. And now, in public health, and I chair Toronto's Board of Health, we've long known that it's your postal code, it's not your genetic code, that determines health status. Access to housing, access to good employment, access to health and social services. These are the factors that determine who gets sick and who doesn't, who lives and who dies. And that's what structural racism is. And that's playing out right now in the midst of COVID. And so today, as I bring greetings, it's to say that to beat COVID, not only do we have to protect those most disproportionately affected, but to beat COVID, we have to address inequity fundamentally now. And that's the opportunity, not just during COVID, but after this, to build a healthier city. And we do that by building a more equitable city. And so when we turn our focus now to vaccines, this is the time, I have to tell you as a city, to do everything we can, working with every expert in every community, to build a vaccine strategy that is actually accessible to all. And that starts with listening to you. It starts with listening to the experts, leaders on the ground in communities they serve and where they live. You know, it's that old saying, nothing about us without us. And so when it comes to our work with the Black community, it starts with you, and it starts with this task force and everybody on the call here today. And I'm just honored to be here to listen and to be part of that conversation. So Akwatu, my apologies if I took too much time there, but it's an honor to be here, and I turn the floor back to you and this incredible panel of leaders that you've assembled.
Thank you so much, Councillor, and thank you for those kind words, those very thoughtful words. So the next item on our agenda is the land acknowledgement. And you know, I think of land acknowledgement as really baby steps towards the co-creation of a new culture of work and a new culture of life that involves a recognition, a deep-seated recognition of the historic role and responsibility that all Canadians have to our Indigenous people grounded in constitutional arrangements. So let me say this and provide this acknowledgement so that we can move forward and with our agenda. We are on the grounds of Takaranto, the traditional territory of Mississaugas, Iroquois, Anishinaabe, and Chippewa. Treaty 13 and Williams Treaty both include Toronto. And as Justice Maurice Sinclair said, we owe it to each other to build a Canada based on our shared future, a future of healing and trust. The next item is the libations. And I'm not gonna make it long. I'm just gonna pour libations. And those of you who know in the culture know that it's a way of sort of bringing our ancestors into the conversation so that the conversation is informed and guided by our struggles and our experiences. And it's Black History Month 2021. I wanted to invite Harriet Tubman, that incredible 19th century figure. She actually died in the 20th century, almost 100 years old. But there was none like her in the 19th century. And she said a lot of things that were really wise and still relevant in 2021, believe it or not. Two things in particular. And she said it in a different way, but it's being said all around the place. When white people get a cold, Black people get pneumonia. That's what she said in the 19th century. And isn't it amazing that in 2021, it's still a reality for people of African descent? The other thing she said was that every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have it within you, the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars and to change the world. Imagine that. She said that during slavery, during the worst years of African bondage. She could think out of the box, imagine incredible things. And so I say to all of you that it's your responsibility to do the same. Think out of the box, imagine incredible things. Imagine that after this pandemic is over, people of African descent will be in a better place than we've ever been. And we'll be making sure that we never have to experience these vulnerabilities again. So I don't have a cup of water here with me, but if I did, I'd just say, Harriet Tubman, and all of you, I would invite you to say, Ashe, Harriet Tubman. All right. And then I'm gonna share my screen so I could just take you through a quick little introductions to the task force and to our program. So give me 1 minute, please. So just in the beginning, I just sort of wanted to reiterate, and I sort of touched on it already, that Black History Month 2021 will be history, as well as a celebration of the struggles of people of African descent. We are making history in so many ways, experiencing historic calamities in so many ways. But there are positive things that are also happening. One of the positive things that's happening is some of the ways that's being tried to address our circumstances. This task force is historic. It's comprised of a wide variety of scientific experts and expertise that have been brought together and marshaled to address a challenge for Toronto as well as for Black people in particular. And it's never been done like this. So I'm hoping that it's a model for others, a model for the world. 2021 is historic because of the circumstances that afflict people of African descent in our city, in North America, in the UK. We have some incredible positivity rates as well as case rates when it comes to COVID, and the statistics are everywhere. Councillor Cressy mentioned some of them, but it goes as high as 2,082 persons per 100,000 for Black people from East Africa, compared to 320 per 100,000 for our fellow white Canadians. Living here in this great city, that's completely unacceptable because it means higher mortality rates for those people who actually experience these conditions with underlying conditions. The economic impact on our communities have been stark and speak for themselves. Job loss, less working hours, less wealth and emergency funds to cope, which means that as a community, we are being impoverished by COVID-19. We are dipping into savings for emergencies because this emergency is just dragging on and on. And of course, there's the increased evictions and homelessness, which haunts so many, and which actually, when you add it up, the stress of it all contributes to additional mental health challenges for our community. We had many mental health challenges to begin with, most of them due to our experiences with socioeconomic inequalities and systemic discrimination, even as we moved up the ladder. One of the things that Black people don't have is the protective factor of wealth and education. When other groups move up the ladder and get more higher education or more income, their risk factors decrease as their protective factor of income and education applies. But for people of African descent, you move up the ladder of education, income, and housing, and some risk factors refuse to change. And so one of them is risk factors for mental health problems because of the stress and having to cope with so many challenges in socioeconomic terms, but the challenges around systemic racism. And so the pandemic is pushing us to new lows, but we are trying to address it. The city is trying to address it. Communities are trying to address it themselves. And I know that some questions have come in. What's going on? Well, what's going on is we've created a task force whose terms of reference include promoting knowledge about the COVID virus and what it means for us, addressing Black community concerns across a spectrum, not just about COVID, but about what drives COVID's impact, the social and economic inequalities that we experience because of race and racism, and developing appropriate policy responses and recommendations. That's what the task force is committed to. And we do that in parallel with the city's commitment to addressing COVID in a variety of ways, addressing COVID and addressing communities that are especially vulnerable, Northeast, Northwest, as well as across specific parts of Toronto. We know that the city has measures in place to expand testing, pop-up testing, mobile testing, increasing transportation support for people who don't have it to get tested. We know that it has supported residents through food supports, through medicine, language translation, providing mental health referrals and mental health supports. We know that it's provided, it's made advocacy efforts to protect housing and income and continues to do so, and is also now preparing for immunization. And one of the ways is through the task force, through the efforts of the task force to address community concerns. There's also a public education working group that's working to make as much resources available in as many languages as possible so people could access the information in ways that are most comfortable to them. So now I say, so what? Now what, before I turn you over to our experts? Well, even if you get vaccinated, you still have to continue to use masks. You still have to practice social distancing. You still have to do the frequent hand washing, because conditions won't change until herd immunity is attained. So whatever your perspective is, we're looking forward to some respectful conversations, respectful engagement, respectful discourse. We're here to answer your questions. We're not here to convince you to be vaccinated. What we want to do is make sure that all the members of our community are fully informed so that they can make a balanced decision when their time comes. So thank you very much. And I'm going to turn you over to Dr. Onye, who will introduce the members of the task force. Dr. Onye. So glad to turn it over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on Zoom and Facebook Live. We are delighted to be here, and this is the first of a series where there will be discussions that we will be having on COVID-19. As Dr. Kwatu Kenti said, my name is Dr. Onye Nnorom, and I am a public health and preventive medicine specialist, a family doctor. I work and teach at the University of Toronto in the areas of Black health, issues of racism and how it impacts health, as well as working at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So I am delighted to introduce our distinguished guests. So I will give each of their bios and then give them each an opportunity to tell us why they are here and why they think it's important to have these discussions. I told Dr. Kenty before we started that I was going to rename the session. It's got a very fancy name, but at the end of the day, we're talking about basically why a whole lot of Black people do not trust this vaccine. And so we need to kind of talk about what those issues are, validate concerns, so we're going to dig into that, but also address reasons why one should also consider getting the vaccine. And so we'll be diving into all of those different topics. But before we do, let me introduce each person. And here, alphabetically, we're going alphabetically by first name. So first is Selena Caesar-Chavannes. So Selena has a Bachelor of Science and an Executive MBA from the University of Toronto, as well as an MBA in Healthcare Management from the University of Phoenix. Although most noted for her service as Member of Parliament with the Government of Canada, representing the town of Whitby, Ms. Caesar-Chavannes is also a renowned research consultant and has worked with a variety of international and Canadian private, government, and non-government organizations. Next is Dr. Isaac Odame. And so Dr. Odame is the hematology section head in the Division of Hematology and Oncology, and the medical director of the Global Sickle Cell Disease Network at the Center for Global Child Health at the Hospital for Sick Children, known as SickKids, in Toronto. He is a professor and director of the Division of Adult and Pediatric Hematology in the Departments of Medicine and Pediatrics at the University of Toronto, and he holds the Alexandra Yeo Chair in Hematology in the University of Toronto. His work with the Center for Global Child Health is building enduring collaborations between clinicians, scientists worldwide to further research and advance care of patients, particularly in low-income countries with the heaviest disease burden. And then finally, Dr. Zainab Abdulrahman. Dr. Abdurrahman is a graduate of the University of Toronto Medical School and completed both her pediatrics and subspecialty training in clinical immunology and allergy at McMaster University. At McMaster Children's Hospital, she is the allergy lead in special immunization clinic focused on vaccine allergy. She is also a practicing allergist in the Greater Toronto area. So welcome, our distinguished guest. So in that order, perhaps we'll continue in the order that I introduced you. So we'll do alphabetical order by first name. So Selena first, to speak to our audience and let them know, a little bit more about yourself and why you think it's important to have this conversation today. Selena.
So thank you very much to Dr. Onye, and thank you, Dr. Kenty, for having me here today. Thank you to everyone who is registered. I see that we have well over 150 individuals in this town hall, so thank you. I'm situated in Whitby, so I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, Williams Treaty Territory. And I think that I want to thank Dr. Kenty for the land acknowledgement right at the beginning. And as stated by Dr. Onye, most people know me for my political background, but my business before getting into politics was as a research consultant, and I managed clinical trials for large pharmaceutical companies throughout the United States and Canada, and in fact, co-chaired Canada's first epidemiology study on neurological conditions. One of the things that I'm most passionate about and why I'm here with this group, and I think it is very historic that we have these experts in science and experts in vaccines, and I'm very honored to be a part of this group. One of the things that I'm really passionate about during the time that I owned that company was the inclusion of marginalized populations in research, having an understanding of why we are not participating, putting responsibility on some of the other physicians to ensure that we are included, because it is a numbers game. There's just not enough Black physicians in Canada to ensure that we are all being seen by Black physicians. So there has to be some education around some other physicians as well to ensure that we're included in this research process. So I think that this is a timely conversation around this vaccine, and I thank you for having me as part of this panel.
Thank you. And so we're looking forward to getting into some of the history and around issues of research and how we've been sometimes included in a way that we have not wanted and or excluded. So thank you, Selena. We'll come back to that. Dr. Odame?
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be part of this town hall. The reason why I'm very excited about being part of the task force is severalfold. My area of expertise is sickle cell disease. And as many of you will know, sickle cell disease predominantly affects people of African descent, although people of Indian and Arabian descent are also affected because of the link to malaria. It was the first genetic disease in humans for which the genetic basis, the molecular basis was known. And yet, because it most predominantly affects people of African descent, investment in research and advancement has lagged behind other comparable inherited diseases like cystic fibrosis. Research investment in cystic fibrosis is about 50 to 100 times what it should be for sickle cell anemia. And in my work and globally, I'm seeking not only to bring awareness about this disease, but also to address the disparities based on race and racial considerations. And it's a similar situation we face here with COVID. And as the introduction highlighted, these disparities in health outcomes is not based on our genetic code, but really on socioeconomic factors that affect people of African descent. And so I'm here to contribute to make sure that we address those disparities and not allow them to widen and to be more intensified. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odame. And so we will appreciate the global lens that you bring, as well as the scientific background. And then next, Dr. Abdurrahman.
Thank you. I'm also really appreciative to have been asked to be on this task force and to be part of the discussion today. As previously mentioned, I'm an allergist and clinical immunologist. I focus on adverse reactions to vaccines as well as vaccine allergy. In terms of why I'm so excited to be part of this, it goes beyond my specialty. It really goes to the fact that, prior to this pandemic, we were aware of the inequities and the structural racism within medicine. But honestly, during this pandemic, I feel like the inequities and the racism has really just almost like shattered and broken open. And we can see how we have been so adversely affected as a community. So I'm here today because I really want to be part of the discussion to talk about how COVID has disproportionately affected the Black population and to talk about what ways that we can hopefully return to allowing us to be recognized and to have hopefully reconciliation with various levels of government that have kind of imposed some of these structural issues, but also find ways for our communities to be able to return to our natural support structures, which means being able to interact more freely with our families, attend religious gatherings, and be more willing participants of our community, which I feel like COVID has stolen from us. And those community supports are really critical and are leading to further issues. So hopefully today will give people an opportunity to kind of discuss the return to that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Abdurrahman. And so, yeah, I think in a moment I'll come to you, and I think what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about the vaccine itself, because I know many of you have questions about that, and we received some questions in advance. And then we're going to dive a little bit into the history to kind of think about the context and also the everyday issues of anti-Black racism that are fueling issues that of distrust with regards to the vaccine. And then we're going to kind of come back again to a bit of the science and how the implications for the Black communities. And so throughout that, I'll start with the questions that I received here, but we will certainly be taking questions from those of you typing in live. So we'll have a balance of both. We're here until 5, so we will take a couple of breaks. So, and my understanding is this is being recorded if you need to step away for a moment. So, so we've gotten a lot of questions about the vaccine itself. And we're going to start with that. And then again, we're going to dive into issues of, we're going to talk about anti-Blackness and all of that. So I want you to all know that we're going to be talking about everything. And we totally appreciate kind of all of the different nuances. But I think sometimes because of what's circulating on like Facebook and WhatsApp, we don't always get like the pure facts about the vaccine. So let's just talk some facts. And so I'm going to go over to Dr. Abdurrahman. Some of the questions that we got were, are the vaccines still in the experimental stages? What are the effects of taking, now? Why do you still have to wear a mask? Those types of questions that people are having about the vaccines. So do you want to kind of give it maybe an overview and then answer those questions, please?
Sure. So, there are a lot of concerns about whether this vaccine is still in the experimental stages. And for a vaccine to be approved, it actually has to already have completed all of the experimental phases. So that means going through very regimented study process and different phases, which I'll go into a little bit more later. But what I can tell you is both the vaccines are currently available in Canada, which are the 2 mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, have gone through all of these checks and balances. So these are approved based on the science, and they have completed their experimental phase. And now we're in the administration phase, which is trying to address that, the protection for our populations. I know there's some concerns about what happens when you get a vaccine, and I'll go into each of those. So I guess I'll break this up if that makes sense. So firstly, for any vaccine, so that includes the vaccines that are currently in use, we go through about 3 different phases with any kind of new treatment, a vaccine, medication, etc. First phase is really, they look at a small group of people and they try to assess the safety of this new treatment. So that was done and it was determined to be safe. There wasn't any concerns about safety signals. And then they moved into a larger phase 2 study. And that means that you look at a larger group, and you look at dosing. Okay, what is the best dosing to get the effectiveness we need to help prevent, in this case, COVID-19 infection in those who get the vaccine? After that part was completed, then they did the phase 3, which is when you go into a very large study and you actually look at the dosing that you found that and has been optimized in phase 2, and then you give it to a big group of people. And here in phase 3 is where you actually try to essentially recreate the populations that we're going to be treating. So, and now because of changes over time with how research is done, there's actually a focus on diversity now in looking at these large trials, which means they actually did spend time making sure they recruited people who were Black and people who are of various racialized groups. So within these studies, they actually had about 9% of people identify as being either Black or African American. And in terms of just to relate this to Canada, across Canada, we're probably only about 3.5%, but specific to Toronto, we're about 9% in terms of the Black population. So these studies can actually reflect our community in terms of the percentage uptake there. And so with this, they looked at this large group of people across the 2 studies. It was about 70,000 people. This may seem smaller when you think of like the whole population of Canada, but what I can tell you is actually in comparison to the previous vaccine studies, these were much larger numbers. So they wanted to make sure they got a huge diverse population, but they also wanted to make sure they got a lot of people so that they could see rates of any kinds of issues within the vaccine. And when they did that, they actually looked at the effectiveness. They looked at people who got the vaccine and who did not. And then with the Moderna vaccine, they found 94.1 and Pfizer vaccine, 95% effectiveness in terms of reducing the risk of the person who is vaccinated from getting symptomatic COVID infection. And what was also great was even if the small percentage that did still get COVID, they did not get severe COVID. Okay, so right now, this is the phase where we are treating people. And by no means are you the first to get it. I want to let you know millions and millions of people across the world have gotten this vaccine. So, something closer to 50 million or more actually in the States who've already gotten this. In Canada, over 1.2 million people have already received it. And in various other countries, millions and millions of people have received these specific 2 vaccines. So by no means is this a study anymore. Now we're actually in the phase of using it to protect the population. One of the questions you mentioned was, what are the effects that will that would happen if you get the vaccine? So whenever you get a vaccine, essentially you're trying to trick your body into thinking you have the infection, but without having all the consequences of having the infection. So your body mounts an immune response because it's like, we're going to get this, we're going to make immunity, we're going to make antibodies, but your body kind of uses certain tricks generally to fight infection. So you might notice you feel a bit tired because your body kind of says, slow down. We want to focus all our energy on the kind of antibody production and disease fighting. We need you to take it easy. So you might feel a bit more tired. You might feel sore at the site because you try to make the arm a bit swollen because you want to stop the infection from further going into your body. That's another trick your body uses. You might feel like a little bit warmer to touch. Some people might develop actual fever. And that's just something else your body uses, because when you raise the temperature, you actually kill many viruses. So these are actually all responses of your immune system. This is why sometimes people think, oh, I think I got the disease from the vaccine, but it's actually because your body sometimes goes through some of those kind of steps. So those are kind of common things that you might see, but a lot of people may actually notice nothing just because their immune system is just working in the background, but they may not notice a lot. So if you take it now, you can expect some of those common things. Are there rare things that may happen with having a vaccine? Yes, with any vaccine, there's some rare reactions. For example, I know there's been a lot of discussion about anaphylaxis to react to vaccines. Most of the vaccines, it's about 1 in a million to have something like that happen. With the Pfizer, it's 5 in a million. Moderna, it's 2.5 in a million doses. Those are still very tiny numbers. And of those, even if you do have anaphylaxis, no one has died from the anaphylaxis, really quickly treated, typically happening in the first few minutes while you're actually still waiting after your vaccine, so they can be quickly managed. So what you can expect is maybe most common sore arm, feeling a bit tired, maybe a mild fever, and then your body is really going to kick in, especially after the second dose, 7 to 10 days after, and give you somewhere between 94 to 95% protection if you do get infected, to protect you against infection from it. And if you do, for any reason, do get it, only have a milder case and not be at risk of having severe infections. So those are, I think, most of the questions.
Yeah, I think you covered. Yeah, and thank you. And we'll come back, but essentially that we are no longer in the experimental phase, as you said. And yes, of course, there are common things that happen to people after having any vaccine, as you said, like perhaps it's a slight fever or increase in temperature, but as far as kind of like very severe events, they're quite rare, and are, everything's being closely monitored, but all standards being met with the 2 that have gotten approval in Canada. So we'll come back to a bit more of this, but I'm wondering if Dr. Odame or Selena have anything they want to add to what Dr. Abdurrahman has mentioned.
Yes, I just want to add that it is worthy of note that before Health Canada approves any drug or vaccine, there are 4 steps that it has to take. First, is it safe? Second, does it work? Third, is the manufacturing process meeting standards of manufacturing? Are they including chemicals that could be injurious to any humans? They look at all that. And then finally, the scientific committee, which is independent, has to decide whether the benefits outweigh the risks. There are risks and side effects to any drug or vaccine, but they look at the benefits and they look at the risks, and they have to determine if the benefits outweigh the risks. That is when they will go forward with approval. And believe you me, these people are people who stake their integrity on the line. If they get it wrong and people come to harm, their jobs are at stake, and some of them may be opening up themselves to litigation, because they do this judiciously. And if they see something that is troubling, you can bet that approval will not happen. So it goes through a rigorous process. And I want to assure my friends and colleagues that that is being done in the background. And that is why we have approval to use these vaccines. Thank you.
Dr. O, the only thing that I would add around approvals is that we have to be really aware that both drug approvals and naturopathic medicines go through the same process. And at present time, there isn't evidence to support the fact that the naturopathic medicines or naturopathic ways of treating COVID vaccine have evidence to support the way it does for these vaccines. So both go through the same rigorous process. They both go through the same kind of procedures in order to get a DIN or a drug identification number or a naturopathic product number. But at this point, there isn't the evidence to support it. And while I know that there's a lot of questions out there about that, it's important to know that the process are the same, but what we're seeing is that the evidence on this side of the vaccine is coming back at a safety and an efficacy rate that we could start to protect our populations.
Thank you for that, Selena. And in fact, when we, I think almost all of us were on G98.7 and we were joined by a doctor of naturopathic medicine who is on the committee. And she also confirmed that yes, people should still take, whatever substances have been approved and help in general, but there is no equivalency as far as protection against the COVID-19 vaccine compared to the vaccines. And so she also spoke to the support for the vaccines, and where I checked myself checked the naturopathic organizations in the UK, the US, here in Canada, there is no dispute from the larger organizations that the vaccine is our best defense at this time. And nobody is, shooting down the naturopathic approaches either. It's simply that the vaccine is our best defense at this time. I'm thinking now, Selena, just because you spoke, in a moment, I would like us to kind of get into the history. So what we provided just here at the beginning is just like the overview that you would probably get at any vaccine session you go to. But this is the Black Task Force. So we're gonna get real into it when we're going to talk about anti-Black racism. So first of all, I am seeing in the chat, and I will come to the questions in the chat, but I've been asked to speak to the questions that came in advance. So I'm not ignoring you folks who are bringing it in the chat. And also the panelists can see the chat too, so can incorporate answers to any of these things in there. And we will not be calling you by name. This is recorded. So we're simply going to answer the questions as we go. We have time, we got you. But I want to kind of acknowledge for us, some of the questions that I'm seeing and some of the questions in advance are about the distrust, right? And in fact, I want to give credit and full understanding and validation of any sense of hesitancy or doubt actually that Black communities are having when a new vaccine or medication comes into our world, okay, based on our history. So yes, we live in a society where there is, and I can say whatever I want, I'm not an employee of anything, so I'm gonna just say it, where we see systemic white supremacy, where we see systemic anti-Black racism, where we see forms of oppression embedded into the structures and systems here in Canada, such that we ended up becoming more vulnerable to COVID-19, not for biological reasons, but because we end up being underemployed, overworked, promoted, and oftentimes just overstretched. And so we are working multiple jobs. We are the people who are more frontline. We are living in conditions, many of us, where there's crowded conditions. And so those are the things that put us at risk for COVID-19, not to mention what we call comorbidities, the hypertension, the diabetes, all that are made worse by the stress of everyday racism. So we're going to talk about the history, but there's also the everyday racism. There's also the fact that we, just put it bluntly, live in a society that historically has devalued and continues to devalue our lives. So when all those people come with a needle and say, get in line, I understand why people say there is a need for pause. In fact, that is traditional wisdom, because that is how we have survived colonization and slavery. Though we don't just run up in line, we take a moment to pause. However, COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted us. So those of us who have engaged in understanding, medicine and research, we're coming to you to kind of give you those facts. And to me, it's like, we're not disregarding the history, and Selena is going to speak to that, the history of what has happened to us and what happened to us in every day. But the factor of the matter is, if tomorrow you walk out there, and I know when we say you, people get worried, but if a person walks out there and gets hit by a car and they have a fracture, right? At the end of the day, the advice is going to be, please go to the hospital. Even though there is a legacy of hospitals not giving us culturally safe care, that would be the best option given the situation. COVID-19 is having a negative impact on our community. It is affecting our collective health. So at this time, the best option for us is the vaccine. And so that is where we are, giving the information to you, but we're not saying you have to go get it. We simply have access to information and we want to relay that here. So that's my speech. I know as a moderator, I'm not supposed to talk too much, but I just wanted to kind of lay that out. As president of the Black Physicians Association of Ontario, I feel like that is the piece that I need to bring here to you when we're saying this is the Black Task Force and as a member of this task force. So Selena, take us back. Let's talk about research. And I'm going to actually look at specifically the questions that we received here, right? And thinking about, let's see, the Tuskegee study, and thinking about our historical experiences and how should that inform our practice going forward. So Selena, please take it away, sis.
So I think you really set up the context quite well. And I actually was reading a document that was shared by Dr. O from the New England Journal of Medicine. And I just want to read the last sentence, which I think is really important. We believe the best way to learn from the atrocities of the past is to change our present. And when we think about Tuskegee, when we think about Dr. Sims, when we think about Harriet Lacks, the fact that we had 600 individuals, Black men, whose sole purpose for Tuskegee was to be a part of a long-term study to see the impacts of syphilis on Black bodies, to really look at how syphilis could destroy, kill Black individuals. Understanding that partway through the experiment, or through, I don't even know if I should call it an experiment at that point. I think we should call it what it is, because it was torture. Partway through, penicillin was found to be an effective treatment. Individuals were still not given the access to that medication. They weren't given any form of knowledge about what was available to them. And one of the most important things, I think, around whether we're talking about Tuskegee or we're talking about Harriet Lacks, that her cells have been used in various, for generations on modern day medicine, extracted from her. Her family has not received any kinds of recognition or compensation. And there's questions in the chat about reparations, and I'll probably add that to my response. Or when we're talking about Sims doing surgery on women, enslaved women, without consent, without anesthesia. Again, torture. These are not research experiments in the classic sense of the word, of clinical trials or clinical research that involved very rigorous processes. So Dr. Abdurrahman gave sort of the phases of the clinical research. Dr. Odame gave sort of what the requirements are for Health Canada to approve. What happens before research even starts, before we even get to the point of talking about whether or not individuals are involved, there are certain phases that we need to go through as physicians, as people that are responsible for the ultimate care of that participant in a research study. The things that did not happen through Tuskegee with Harriet Lacks and with Sims and forced sterilization, there's a whole bunch that we could get into, but we just don't have that kind of time, is the fact that there wasn't any informed consent. Individuals were brought into a quote unquote research program, but they weren't given any information about what they were actually getting involved in. And I really want, again, I go to the sentence that I spoke about at the beginning, where the best way to learn from our atrocities of the past is to change our present. Right now, what we are providing here with this task force is the information. Keeping in mind the context that our social, economic, physical, and mental health has been really impacted and negatively impacted by present day structural and overt racism, microaggressions, or small r racism. I think death by 1,000 cuts is exactly the same as racism throughout every facet of our community, whether we're talking about child welfare, justice, or our healthcare system. We know that it exists. And so one of the things when we're talking about informed consent, and somebody put something in the chat about the misinformation that we see through WhatsApp and social media, what we are trying to do with this task force is provide that evidence, to provide that information. And just to be clear, while I could plug it to answer the question online about how's the task force going to limit or reduce the misinformation being shared, is that we've set up an Instagram page at BC19TF. So people could go to there and see the myths that are being spread through misinformation and actually see the information that is correct. Unfortunately, a lot of misinformation is being spread, and it's adding to and augmenting the fear that currently exists and the mistrust that is currently represented in our communities. As Dr. O said, that mistrust is absolutely rightly placed. It is rightly placed because we know that there has been and continues to be a disproportionate negative impact on Black people when it comes to COVID-19. However, the reality of the situation today is such that irrespective of what we're afraid of, this disease is killing us. It is killing us at disproportionate rates globally. As Councillor Cressy said, we make up 9% of the population of the city of Toronto, 25 or 30% of the impact, 25% of hospitalizations. That means that families are worse off in these conditions. So what we're trying to do right now, again, is not to convince you, but to sort of separate the fact from fiction when it comes to taking the vaccine. And again, understanding the most critical part of the research process, the most critical part of getting involved is the consent part, and it's informed consent. You have to be informed with that information. And to the point around naturopathic medicines, understanding that they do go through the same process. It goes through the same process as a vaccine, but there isn't evidence to show that those naturopathic remedies have the same impact as the vaccine. So I'll leave it there for now, Dr. O, and turn it over to any other questions that we may have.
Oh, thank you, Selena. That was really great to think about how, and the issue of consent and how the past definitely warrants, and the present warrants, a certain care that must be taken going forward. And some of it is not so much in the distant past too. One of the questions, and I'm going to ask Dr. Odame to add to what you just spoke to, which one of the questions that came in advance when you were speaking, it reminded me of one of the questions that we got ahead of time from people who had mailed in advance, said, Pfizer had played a role into going into Nigeria without permission and using a drug that was not approved and testing it on children, right? And that would have been in the 1990s, 1996, if I remember correctly. So
that's very recent.
Yes, that is very recent. So Dr. Odame, do you want to speak to that? Like, let's put everything out in the open and bring those things forward. Dr. Odame?
Absolutely. It's important that we shed some light on all these issues. So science itself is seeking the truth. But science without ethics is destructive. You need the ethics as a basis to ensure that the truth that you gather is applicable to all and is acceptable to all. So what Pfizer did in that study, so they had this drug which had been studied, it was an antibiotic, had been studied in adults, and they wanted approval for children. Now, in West Africa, seasonally, they get outbreaks of meningitis. And this happens almost like we are facing this pandemic. So it spreads through the community. A lot of children die of meningitis. So what Pfizer did, because this is time limited, what they did was within a short time, cobbled together a trial, ran into Nigeria, didn't ensure that there was proper ethical approval, that the parents of these children were well informed. They went in there to try to treat some children with a new antibiotic and gave half the children a well-known antibiotic to try to demonstrate that the new medicine works in children and can treat meningitis. There were many things wrong. It was rushed. It didn't go through proper ethical approval. The parents weren't told that they were going to use an experimental drug on their children. Even the dose of the standard drug that they used to treat meningitis was less than it normally is used. They didn't tell the parents that actually Médecins Sans Frontières was offering treatment for meningitis within the same hospital. So these parents had no knowledge. And the Nigerian doctor who was leading the trial didn't ensure that this had gone through proper ethical processing. But thank goodness, people talked and people blew the alarm. Whistleblowers within Pfizer itself expressed the fact that they were dissatisfied with the conduct of the trial. It was rushed in order to get approval. Ultimately, I'm happy to say that the drug didn't get the approval they wanted. And even the approval in Europe, which had already been granted, had to be withdrawn because the drug was associated with toxic effects on the liver. So whilst it is a sad story, I think the system worked in a sense because whistleblowers and people who were dissatisfied made their voice heard. And this became a litigation issue that Pfizer had to settle. And the families have been compensated for the harm that has been done, that they were mistreated, they were not respected. So the thing here is that ethics is the strongest it's ever been, but there's still room to go. I'm happy to report that in all of Africa, you couldn't now go into Africa and conduct a clinical trial without a proper ethical approval in the country itself. And in fact, I work on sickle cell disease. It takes us longer to get approval in countries in Africa for sickle cell studies than it does in Europe and America because the Africans are now very, very much aware. They make sure that they have looked into every detail to make sure that these events that happen in Nigeria are not repeated.
Thank you, Dr. Odame. I like that. They look into every detail. And so that's why I'm enjoying the questions that are coming. It is okay. You know, when I used to work at Taibu Community Health Center, right? That's our community health center here in Toronto that has a mandate to serve the Black community. Remember our executive director, Lieben, you know, when people would say, you know, there would be town halls and people would say, we don't have enough of this, we need more of this. And you say, yes, that's what this is for. Because once upon a time, we didn't have those opportunities to come and say we need more. So yes, when your doctor offers you something, ask questions. You came here to ask us the questions. We'll answer you and we'll do our best. This is what it is for. So you can hold us accountable. You can ask us and we will try our best to relay that information. As you said, in Africa, they ask all those questions. And then when it meets the standards, that is when they go through. And so we're here, like we said, to help separate fact from fiction and to give you the information that is available to all of us and to distill that here for you. Selena, I see that you have unmuted yourself. So I'm sensing there's something you want to add. Please do.
Yeah, you know, Dr. O, I just want to be very cognizant of people asking questions when they go to their physicians and still being rushed throughout the process or being dismissed I could tell you that two of my children had Kawasaki disease, which is rare in Black families from what I hear. So when my second child, Johnny, was presented, and it's a very classical disease, you're supposed to have 5 days of very classical symptoms. And he went in, he's darker than my daughter. And they said, well, he can't possibly have Kawasaki because his skin isn't red. And if I didn't already know about my previous child having Kawasaki, to insist that no, I don't think you've seen a Black child with red skin, but this child has red skin, they would have sent me home. And I want to acknowledge that there are individuals who are part of this group, the 150 plus who are saying, yes, I challenge my doctor, and often I'm met as being an antagonist, as being the person that is in the wrong. And I want to acknowledge that. But in this particular case, I think it's really important that, again, one of the reasons why this task force is so important, and the ability for people to reach out to us online, on social media, through the town halls, through some of the efforts that we're doing, is to be able to bounce some of these questions off, to say, no, I heard differently through this task force. I heard that X was, me having diabetes, or my chronic condition is part of a comorbid condition for COVID-19. I want to protect myself. And what I'm saying to you, really, to the 168 people who are on here, is to stand firm in that, because there are some differences between how we react to medications, what our genetics are. And again, a lot has to do with the postal code that we live in, but we know ourselves and we know our bodies. And I think that at this point, we really need to start talking about how we could advocate for Black patients as Black experts in this task force as well.
I love it. Absolutely. I think that is so important, how we begin to advocate. And I know there are questions that are more broad, right, about social determinants of health, housing, and all of these pieces. So we're going to have a break and we'll come back to that, because that is part of it, right? That's part of, like what I said, has made us experience more vulnerability to COVID-19. And those were issues that existed before COVID-19 that we need to be working together to dismantle, but also the experiences of Black patients in healthcare and being dismissed or not believed, and not getting access to information. So that's why we're doing these sessions, to give you as much information as possible and to advocate for that kind of change. And so what we'll do, though, in the spirit of wellness, is take a 10-minute break. So we're at 3:02. I wanted to do it at 3, but we'll take a break. Maybe we'll call it an 8-minute break, because I think it's harder to keep track. So we'll come back at 10 after and perhaps dig a little bit deeper into some of the questions that you folks have provided to us here. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So thank you all for rejoining us. And at the 4 o'clock hour, we'll have a 10-minute break as well, both for you to be able to take a break. We're giving a lot of information, but also for our panelists to have a moment. So again, my name is Dr. Onye Nnorom. I'm a family physician and public health specialist. I work at the University of Toronto in the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. I'm also the president of the Black Physicians Association of Ontario, and also host of a podcast I forgot to mention earlier, Race, Health, and Happiness, where we talk about staying well in a racialized world. And I think that's very relevant for what we're going to be diving into, the questions that you folks are sending us about how to stay well in a COVID-19 world, but also in general. And so I want to give space to some of the questions we got earlier about thinking beyond COVID-19 and the vaccine, thinking about what we call in medicine social determinants of health, which is like the conditions in which we're living and working, and our children are playing in. And so when it comes to the broader social issues that made us more vulnerable to COVID-19 infection, housing and income and those types of things. The City of Toronto is taking some steps. We as a task force are aware of those things. And I could say for each of us in our organizations, like the Black Physicians Association of Ontario, we are doing our best to address and advocate for change. So I know for the City of Toronto, and Dr. Kenty can perhaps add more to that later on, but I know the City of Toronto certainly is providing some emergency measures around evictions and trying to stop evictions, has been advocating for paid sick leave, because that's a major factor. And then I would say specifically, I can speak for my own organization. So for the Black Physicians Association of Ontario, definitely when it comes to health equity issues broadly for the Black community, that is part of our mandate. And so addressing whether it's housing or income, all of it, and particularly systemic anti-Black racism, and particularly what is faced in the hospitals. We need better representation in the hospitals. We need better training of staff around issues of anti-Black racism and how to provide culturally appropriate care, decolonization training, because they need to start from the beginnings. And so those are things that are actually part of what a lot of us are doing, either within the task force or in our own groups. And in fact, we have been doing that work previously. But the COVID-19 situation has made it such that, I was telling Selena, I like to quote her when she says the village is showing up. And so many of us have been in our different corners advocating in different ways, but now this gives us an opportunity to come together and have these discussions. And this is not the only webinar. We're going to have more within the City of Toronto, but I know many religious groups are having them. Taboo Community Health Center will be having one. We're going to have lots of discussions. And we need to have those discussions, and we need to gather, and we need to talk about these issues, again, regarding the vaccine and beyond. And I know there's going to be sessions even covering mental health, right? So rest assured that we're going to be very broad and holistic overall over time, and when you look at the number of sessions about these issues. But again, people wanted to have, the fact from fiction and some of the historical context around COVID-19. So that being said, I know that there have been questions in the chat, and lots of them. So I'm grateful to the group that's managing this diversity talks for kind of consolidating some of these comments. So Zainab, I'm calling you by first name. Nope. Dr. Abdurrahman, I have some questions for you. So we'll go with you first. And again, we're kind of going back into the pure sciences of it. But if you can explain the development and the vaccine, specifically touching on the mRNA technology.
Okay, so I know a lot of people feel that mRNA technology is very new, but actually some of the information.
Oh dear, is it? I'm not sure. I cannot hear you, and I'm not sure if it's my. You can hear Dr. Abdulrahman? Okay, so then it's my connection. Please go ahead. Sorry, go on.
So a lot of people have been concerned that mRNA is new. It's brand new technology, but in actual truth, it's not. It's actually been worked on since the 1990s. And the big issue actually was trying to find a way for mRNA to stay stable so that we could use it in a vaccine. And people who've been working on this have been continuing to do so since 1990. And it's actually been used in other forms of disease, namely in cancer. But this was the first time that they actually decided.
I wonder if it's helpful. I know that person asked specifically about mRNA technology, but do you want to maybe describe what mRNA is just a little bit?
Yes, sure. That's actually a great point. Okay, so I realize I sometimes just kind of use the term, but mRNA means messenger RNA, and it's a form, essentially we have our DNA, which is what encodes kind of what we are in terms of making different parts, proteins in our body. But the way that happens is you have your DNA, and then your DNA stays inside in a very special protected area. But anytime we want to make a certain thing in our body or make a protein, you go into this kind of special enclosed protected library. So it stays protected, and then it says, okay, here's a copy. Here's how you make it. So you make messenger RNA, and that's what it is. It's a copy from your special library called your DNA that you will then send out, and then it will go to special worker bees called your ribosomes, which will then copy out. And essentially, think of it as you say, I would like a blue chair. And then you give this to someone who makes the upholstery and the wood, and then they take it and they kind of process your instructions, and then they create this protein. So mRNA is a copy that tells builders how to make something. Because we're human, we do not have capacity to take RNA and take it back into our DNA. It's a one-way street when you're human. So our DNA stays very well protected within our cells inside basically a tiny prison in a bigger prison. So it's called your nucleoli in your nucleus of your cell. So it's got like all this protection. And when you want to make something, you'll get a copy of it. And that copy goes out. And after the copy is done, that mRNA, it gets attacked. So once you've made the protein, that gets destroyed and it doesn't stay in your cells. If it's caught outside your cells, it gets destroyed by immune system who, once it sees mRNA outside, it knows that's a no-go, it cleans it up. So that's what mRNA is, okay? So firstly, I know people were very worried that it would go back and incorporate into their DNA. That does not happen. It's a one-way street. And that's
right.
the feature of being human.
Right. And so I'm just going to come in and say, so when we're talking about the mRNA vaccine, because it contains the mRNA, it's not getting into the nucleus, into that like well-guarded house where our DNA is. So it's not entering there, but it is in the cell, and it has that blueprint to like make that blue chair or what we need for protection, but it's not having any interaction with our DNA.
Yes. Okay. And think of it as that little blue chair that you make for the virus is like a palace, okay? The blue chair happens to be one of the pieces of furniture in the palace, but you can only make this tiny blue chair. So you cannot recreate the entire palace. You don't have any instructions on how to build the building blocks for bricks or mortar. You don't have anything to make like vases or other things that are part of the palace. You can only make this tiny blue chair. But this blue chair is similar in this type of a virus. And I know there was a concern about variants. So variants also have parts of the blue chair in them. Maybe it's a little different. Maybe it's a little flare of this and a flare of that in the blue chair, but it still has similar parts to the blue chair. So your body will still recognize some of the pieces of the new variants. And there is information coming out showing that these vaccines, even though they were made for the kind of original vaccine, do have some response to the different variants. And that information is forthcoming, but some of them have already been showing the peer-reviewed data for that, okay? So we know it can't go back in. It can affect our personal DNA. You can only make a small part of it so that your body can recognize it when it comes through the door, but it will not recreate the entire virus, so the virus cannot infect you. And because coronaviruses, the blue chair we're making is called the spike protein. And this is actually what gives if you look at the virus, it looks like it has a ring around it or a crown, which is why they're called coronaviruses. So all of them make this type of a blue chair, even if they're slightly different sometimes in terms of some of the parts of it, but they have some similarities. So you will still have some protection, even though there's new variants coming out, and there's more data coming out every day about the protection towards the new variants for the 2 vaccines we have, as well as the other vaccines that are coming into play across the world. Okay. And I think, was that most of the question?
Yeah, no, that answers the question. And I think actually in thinking about the mRNA, and Dr. Odame or Selena, feel free to jump in. I think one of the things that people have wondered about is, because it's a different type of vaccine, why was this different type of vaccine all of a sudden being used for COVID-19 and developed quickly? What people are saying rushed. And my understanding, so I'm going to give you my understanding, because
Yes.
and then I want you to kind of add to it or correct it, because I am not as specialist in this area as you are. But from my readings, my understanding is, like, when it comes to mRNA, there were benefits of how quickly it can be made, because you don't have to grow cells or do any of the things that are done with the traditional vaccines. And you don't have to get into issues of, people were worried, is it halal, or, what kind of cells are being used? You're not dealing with cells. So it's able to be made rather quickly. But it has to be held at high temperatures. There's a lot of things that made it inconvenient as a technology previously. But in the context of COVID-19, where we are in a pandemic and need something to be produced efficiently, it was almost like the right type of technology at the right time, almost like having without saying the name of the different smartphones or whatever, but it's really kind of like having that intersection of the right type of technology at the right time. The other more standard vaccines are still being produced, but they take longer. So that was my understanding, because I also, doing my work around anti-racism, came in with a certain level of skepticism, but I had to look at the facts and I said, okay, this actually makes a lot of sense. But please feel free, any of you, to correct me.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's that serendipity moment that there was this technology, there was this knowledge, but also everybody poured money into this. So there was also a focus of resources. This technology was being looked at when we had that first SARS outbreak, and they actually started working on it. And there's a lot of difficulties. It requires a bit more work in terms of stabilization, and that's why it has to be kept at such low temperatures. But what happened with SARS was there wasn't further outbreaks, kind of continuous outbreaks of SARS. So there wasn't money poured into continuing work on the SARS vaccine. So unfortunately, that's what happens when you are a company making something for production to make profit, is if that issue is no longer kind of haute couture or high end, you're not going to pursue it at that time. You're looking for something to make impact on disease, and SARS kind of quietly petered out. We actually thought SARS was going to keep coming back, but then it didn't. So then they didn't continue it, but they'd actually started working on this technology with that. So when this happened with SARS-CoV-2, so a similar virus in the same family, they said, hey, you know what? We had this technology. We didn't spend the extra time because it was going to take a lot of money, a lot of resources. Here we go. We have the whole kind of focus on it, tons of resources. Lots of countries were looking to invest in it, and they were able to do it because it is expensive technology. It did take a while to kind of stabilize it in the high technology in terms of the low temperatures it has to be kept at, but there was a focus right now. And this disease has blown out more so than SARS ever did. And so there was a need to kind of focus on it. So they took technology that was already there, but had not had as much money poured into it, and continued that work. So this work had already been started. It's just that disease did not pan out to be as much of a problem as we thought it was going to be. And I'll kind of welcome any other comments from the
I think
others.
Dr. Odame wanted to add something
Yeah,
to that.
if I may add to that.
Thank you.
So the technology already existed, but actually before these vaccines, the vaccine that has been fastest in developing was the mumps vaccine, and that took 4 years. So admittedly, this has been at a very, very fast pace. And I can understand why people are a little sort of suspicious that this has been too far. It's been a lightning pace. But actually, it's a celebration of science. And I think we have a positive message here that when investment is made into science, it works. I work in sickle cell anemia. recently investments have been made in sickle cell anemia that now we think cure can be available for a number of people with sickle cell anemia. So the limitation is the investment. And in this COVID crisis, the extent of collaboration between governments and the private sector and in terms of investment has been unprecedented. So it was the coming together to invest billions of dollars to bring scientists together, to bring the private sector together, and to be able to speed up a process that normally takes long because you have to prove that your first stage is successful before you get more investment to go to the second stage, before you get more investment to go to the third stage. Here, they guaranteed that when the results are good, you can proceed to the next stage. And even once you've gone beyond the next stage, you can then begin production of the vaccine, even though you don't know that it's going to work. And we guarantee that your losses will be covered. So that's what industry needed. They needed that kind of backbone to say, if it doesn't work, our investment will not go to waste. We'll be able to recover our costs. And it's the combination of all this together that brought us this success. And lastly, we've been pretty lucky. I mean, nobody knew how successful these vaccines were going to be. I mean, to get 60% efficacy would have been good news, but 95%, it was unexpected. So for me, we should be celebrating. We should be saying, great, this is unexpected. This science is working, and go for it. Science is truth. Yes, the ethics can be bad and racism can be part of it, but the science itself is pursuance of truth. So let's trust the science. And by the way, a lot of Black scientists were involved in developing this vaccine. You've heard of Dr. Corbett at the NIH, who actually was involved in how to perfect the messenger RNA, get just the right sequences to make sure that the vaccine works to that efficiency. So we should be celebrating Black science as well while we think of taking this vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Odame. I love your enthusiasm. We should be celebrating, jubilating that we have some evidence for really great protection with this vaccine. So thank you for bringing that lens. And I think so. People are having a lot of. We're getting a lot of questions about the vaccines itself. So I'm going to kind of build on that. When we think about the process that underwent, I think one way to think about what you just described, Dr. Odame, where you said, the resources were there and everything that people thought wasn't possible, that had kind of fallen to the wayside that Dr. Abdurrahman mentioned. I think we can also thinking about it when we think about like even healthcare or work, like, I'm a mother, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. There are times where I wanted to work from home and everybody's like, no, it's just not possible. I have patients who have, agoraphobia. They're afraid to come outside. And it was like, no, you have to come to the clinic. We cannot do it. But when the pandemic happened, all of a sudden there was a realization that yes, there are things that we can do that we thought that we couldn't do, right? And so a lot of the things that where there had been roadblocks and things not made possible, they were made possible. And I think that is also potentially for us the case when it comes to anti-Black racism and these issues where people said, oh, it wasn't possible and we can't do this. And our policies are such and such, like this is the time. This is a very interesting time where everything is up in the air and we can rebuild and think about doing things differently. And that's happened with the vaccine. And I'd like to see it happen in so many other areas. But that's one of the things that the pandemic has done. It's made us question what we thought was not possible and to really kind of see amazing things that are possible. Now, with that, as far as possibilities though, so I'm going to, oh, Selena, I saw that you unmuted. Did you want to add something?
No, I was going to add some glass half empty to this conversation.
Yeah, okay.
As Selena, the eternal pessimist, but to answer one of the questions that came in about the prison population. So do you mind if I jump to that? And
yes, do you want to, because not everybody can see the questions. Do you want me to read the question or do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead and then I'll do my.
Okay. So Yeah, so when we think about the different opportunities, we still have to keep it real as far as the things that we are experiencing. So a question came, and some of these are consolidated questions, so it might not be exactly the way the person asked it if we got multiple of the same question. But basically, since we know that some of our largest population to get COVID-19 is us Black folks, because of our postal code and social class systems, how are we going to help our fellow Black folks in the prison systems? As they are having outbreaks too. We have a high population of us in these prisons too. So Selena, please.
Yeah, so I'll draw people's attention to, if they don't know what is happening within our prison systems as it relates to anti-Black racism. The Globe and Mail did a wonderful report a little while ago called Bias in the Prison System or something like that, where at the end of the day, we're looking at Indigenous people making up 8% of the Canadian population, but 25% of the prison population. Black people, of course, making up 3.5% of the Canadian population and close to 9% of the prison population. But the Correction Services Canada does publish daily or recent reports on what is happening in terms of COVID-19. There's been over 25,000 tests given in the federal prisons. Right now, I actually just have to look it up to make sure I had it right. There are a little over 1,200 cases, positive cases. There's been 5 deaths and 9 active cases across the country. So you could go to Correction Services Canada's webpage and actually look at what is happening as of February 11th. So as of a couple of days ago, what's happening in our prison system. But I think here this highlights a couple of different things that we're talking about. And I really hope that we're able to leverage COVID, not just seize this opportunity right now to put money into science and put those investments into research that are required, but also capitalize on these moments to look at some of those other disparities that exist within our system. So when we're talking about some of these hotspots in the Northwest, the Northeast, hotspots in Toronto in particular, I'm hoping that we could think about how we make infrastructure investments differently. Because when we think about these buildings and how the air is circulated within these buildings, we really have to think about, do we want, if we have another outbreak, so we had SARS, we have COVID, we'll be foolish to think that something like this will not happen again. So how do we use this moment where we know that governments before that were saying, well, we can't turn on a dime, obviously can turn on a dime and make things happen. How are they going to make investments in infrastructure in particular? But when we talk about daycare, when we talk about housing, when we talk about paid benefits, when we really look at the data around COVID-19 and understand that those PSWs, those people, that 25% of hospitalizations that are Black individuals are mainly Black women, right? And we really need to think about the wraparound services that we should be paying particular attention to when it comes to how we're able to respond to this, how women are able to, or individuals are able to be able to stay home, to get tested, to take days off when they're sick. Where are they bringing their children? What does that home look like? What does that opportunity look like? What does access look like for people? This is not just about pouring money into research funding that helps everybody. We have the race-based data. Toronto took a very anti-racist approach to collecting race-based data. And I think the city should be commended on that. But now you have this data, you see where the disparities exist. Now it's time to make those investments in those disparities, because if COVID is showing you anything, we do not want those disparities to further grow. They're highlighting some of the places where those investments are required. And I'm hoping that this task force, in addition to giving information about the vaccination and giving people the opportunity to have informed consent, that we're also leveraging this opportunity to help the community more broadly, and in particular when we're thinking about people with socioeconomic challenges that need to be addressed. That was a long response to say, go to Canada, Correction Services Canada to get the answer. But I think that there's a lot of intersecting pieces here.
Yes, no, and those are very important pieces. And I would say that's not glass half empty. That is really like, let us figure out how we fill this cup, because as a community, we have been working from an empty glass. We are, like I said, underhoused, overworked, and those are things that put us at risk. And even with, a vaccine, yes, is part of that strategy, but there's so many bigger pieces that we need to be addressing. And, from a public health standpoint, these pandemics, there had been a pandemic before, these things happen about every 100 years. And personally, I'll be damned if we're in this situation again as Black people. So it becomes like, we need to make sure that these socioeconomic disparities, not just for Black people, but overall, are addressed. Otherwise, we're going to keep recreating the same thing. So I think there's a lot to learn from, and a lot to, like you said, kind of seize this opportunity in a way to address these issues. Now,
add one small point to this. I'm sorry.
Yes, and I'm going to ask you another question right after that. So
yeah,
add whatever you like.
But I really believe that this is a moment where we have some really smart people that take an intersectional feminist approach to policy development. And this is where we need to have some of like the Pauline seniors at advisory tables who are geniuses in terms of how we move forward with policy development from that perspective. Because once you're able to lift the ones that need it the most, you're going to help the entire population. There's no doubt about that. And we need to focus on some of these other issues. Vaccinating people is going to get us to a particular point, but that's a short-term strategy. We need long-term strategies as well.
No, I agree. And it's with that feminist approach, like you said, of thinking about intersectionality, all of the different identities that further marginalize us, whether it's sexual orientation or it's the prison system or low income or education, all of these kind of, really kind of compound the impact that that kind of all conditions have on us and socioeconomic status of Black peoples. Now with that though, so there's a piece where we have to kind of address the larger mainstream society and say, these are the factors that have impacted us and these need to be addressed. And again, we're not the only group that has been impacted, but we have been uniquely impacted with regards to COVID-19. But then there's communicating within our communities, right? So that's what we're doing today. And to let you know, we're also on YouTube Live. So you keep saying 154, but there's many people. Yes, there's another 100 or so on YouTube Live. But there's a question here for you about, yes, are there other ways to reach Black communities? Let's thinking about like WhatsApp or those who are not as tuned in with social media and less technologically inclined. There's people who might benefit from this information, but they're not going to be on Facebook Live or here with us on Zoom. So thoughts on that, Selena?
Yeah, so I shouldn't say that I'm the originator of these thoughts. I think as a task force, we've put many different ideas together around how we're going to engage people. Of course, social media allows us to kind of get that broad message out in a quick way and disseminate it fast and cheap, to be honest. But the other strategies include going to or visiting centers of worship. If they're doing their worship online, some of our task force members are meeting people where they are. Traditional mainstream media, newspapers, ethnic papers. I think that at this point, we need to have an all hands on deck approach. But to the people that are on the line and watching through Facebook or through YouTube, I think that this can't just be about the 15 or so, 20 or so experts and scientists that are in this group. We need to take this information and activate our networks. Now we have this information. Now you have this information. Now you activate your network and say, here's some information that you could get. Not everybody's going to be able to get it online, but we can expect that once this information starts to travel, we are going to be the ones that are going to be responsible for carrying this information, for carrying these messages, not just to the people that we know in our communities, but throughout the diaspora. because this is not just something that we need to contain within our own 4-block radius. We need to make sure that we're taking care of our people in the islands. We're sending out information about how to dispel some of this misinformation throughout the things that we're doing. So you are now armed with this information. You are now the responsible carriers of some of this information. I think we need to activate our different networks and share that information as much as possible so that more people are engaged in this conversation.
Yes, I love that, thinking about activating our networks. And I'm going to come to Dr. Odame. I'm going to ask you next, because I think we need to think about all of the different ways that we can inform people about this vaccine. And I do know that, you know, in Canada, we're able to kind of observe what's happening around the world, right? So, you know, particularly in the UK, people are, you know, getting ready for the vaccine. In the US, they're distributing. In fact, I know, having spoken to a physician out in Philadelphia, where they're doing vaccines for Black communities, like at the churches, what they're seeing is a lot of rich white people actually coming to poorer Black neighborhoods where they had never visited before, and lining up for the vaccine and making the lines even longer, because people really want this vaccine, but they are kind of leveraging their privilege. And what she was saying is that when testing was an issue and wasn't available in Black communities, Black people were turned away when they went to those other neighborhoods for testing. But there is huge demand for this vaccine. So it's so important that, you know, as we prepare in Canada for it to kind of be distributed in the community, that you folks have the information. And so if you want it, that you will be in line and be able to get it in time. So to do that, you need the information. And so for Dr. Odame, I have a couple of questions about coming kind of back to the vaccine and thinking about the intersection of biology and being of African descent. So there are a question about how does the vaccine impact people of African descent? I think that was one question, actually. And then how does it affect people with diabetes? So maybe first you could speak to African descent, and then we can just speak broadly about having the vaccine when you have diabetes.
Thank you. To put it in context, let me give you a little bit of historical background, because it is said that if we don't learn from history, history will likely repeat itself. And I'm talking about polio. So in the early 1920s, polio broke out in the United States. And white folks said, polio doesn't affect Blacks. It affects only whites. And so when President Roosevelt and others established a rehabilitation center for paralyzed white children to get rehabilitated, Blacks were denied use of those resources because epidemiological data stated that, oh, it doesn't affect Blacks. It only affects whites. And for years, Blacks who had polio were completely ignored. It took almost a decade of Black activism and the work of Black physicians and scientists to show that polio affects Blacks the same way it affects whites. In fact, when the polio vaccine was discovered, Black activists had to fight to ensure that Blacks also receive the polio vaccine. You all remember the case of Brown versus the Board of Education in Alabama. The Black children were not allowed in the school to get their vaccines. They got their vaccine on the lawns in front of the school because it was segregated. Years came by before Blacks fought for that vaccine. And in the first trial, Black scientists and Black activists ensured that Black children were included in that initial trial of the polio vaccine. And that's how Blacks were able to eliminate the inequities that was involved with the polio vaccine. Over 100 years now, we have COVID vaccine. And I have to tell you that COVID is affecting us more, not because we are any different, but because of the social factors. We work in areas where we are more likely to get it. We don't have adequate housing. We work in jobs that expose us. We have more underlying conditions that are not well controlled. And that's why it's affecting us more. And my message is, let us not allow the inequities to widen because we refuse to take this vaccine. The way to fight the inequities is to be smart, is to be to expose them, to talk about them the way Selena has talked about, to press for policy to address it, and to use science. During the polio era, the Blacks said, we want Blacks to be included in clinical trials. We want Blacks to receive benefit from the advancement of science. We don't want to be back of the line when there's new treatment for diabetes, new treatment for cancer, new treatment for all these disorders. We don't want to be at the back of the line. We want to be in front and included. So with the development of this vaccine, nearly 10% of the people on whom these vaccines were tested were of people of African descent. In fact, if you look at the other vaccines like the AstraZeneca vaccine, South Africa played a big role in the development of those vaccines. So we do know that they work on Blacks just as well as they work on whites. And in fact, the adverse events, the side effects were not any different in Blacks than it was in whites. So the researchers took pains to make sure that enough representation of Black people, and I tell you, our ancestors have fought for this. They fought with their lives to make sure that we were not excluded from these clinical trials. That's why we can confidently say that the vaccines work in Blacks as well as they work in whites. The tragedy is that many more people of African descent live in poor parts of the world. And for that fact alone, they are going to be at the back of the line because their countries will not be able to afford. We live in a country that can afford it. We shouldn't accentuate this disparity. We shouldn't. Let us use the benefit of science, which Blacks have contributed to actually, and let it benefit us. So let's not allow history to repeat itself. Had they not fought in the 1920s and 30s, polio will have ravaged the Black community and will have caused a lot of paralysis and deaths. They fought hard for it, and we are fighting for it now. So I'm telling my Black brothers and sisters, this is not a time to sort of back down and say this is not for us. It is for us just as it is for white people. And we should make sure that the protection it can give our people to make sure that our loved ones don't die, and that we'll be there for our loved ones, and that we can see their face and touch them. That is what we're talking about. So please, yes, we have a lot to talk about in the historical past. We have a lot to talk about disparities, but this is our opportunity to really talk about these disparities and to make sure that we have the advantage to take this vaccine. I will end with this. Had the city or the government not focused on Black hesitancy, I will say that it will be a violation of ethics. Because when you are applying a solution to a problem, you look at those who are most affected first. Those are the ones to tackle, the elderly folks, those in residential homes, in nursing homes, those working in the front lines, those who are at risk, the doctors, the nurses, the technicians, the people who work in the hospitals. Those are the ones to tackle first. And if our people are in the front lines and they are exposed, it is only right that they receive a priority. If they don't, that will be a violation of normal ethics of making sure that the solution is distributed equitably. That's the way I want us to look at it, and not to back down and say that this is not for us. It is for us just as it is for white folks.
Thank you for that, Dr. Odame. And again, I love your enthusiasm because you've been studying this for so long and know the history there. And I think, fundamentally within what you just described is the fact that we know that first of all, race is a social construct. So that is why when we see racial disparities, it's due to social issues. Biologically, we are the same, okay? It's like white cat, black cat, whatever. It's just different melanin and hair. And so at the end of the day, biologically, we are the same as white folks. And we were taught that we were biologically different because that's what was used to uphold slavery and colonialism and to say that whites were superior and that we were biologically different. And so that's a very important point. And so, of course, with the studies, we're seeing that it comes out the same way. But what we're seeing with the COVID-19 infections is it's not coming out the same way. And it's because of the social factors. And as you said, we need to rise up and address the social factors, as Selena had mentioned, but at the same time, make sure that we are protected against this disease. So the two work hand in hand as far as we are concerned. Now, that being said, though, there had been a question in there about, I know you said, and I will close with this, but there had been a question about comorbidities and diabetes and other conditions. Do you want to speak to that?
Right. So you hear the term that the Canadian healthcare system is universally accessible. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, even though we have OHIP wouldn't cover drug medications when you are out of hospital. And if you don't work in a place where your insurance covers drugs, you're not going to be able to afford drugs to treat chronic conditions. For this reason, we do know that Blacks who have diabetes or hypertension have their disease less well controlled compared with their white counterparts because they can't always afford, they are not as well monitored, and the sort of jobs and hours they work and everything really complicates their disease. So we do know that already, and this data has been well collected in the UK and the United States. I think we are encouraging Canada to collect more race-based data, and we were congratulating the city of Toronto for doing that about COVID. I think we need more data to show that outcomes of diabetes and chronic other conditions among Blacks is worse than it is in whites. So because of that, people of African descent, Blacks within Canada, are more at risk of dying when they get the infection. And they are more likely to be hospitalized for the same reason. And they are more likely to be exposed to the virus. So if you have diabetes, you should definitely be considered a priority for this vaccine. And I know that many jurisdictions that I have relatives in the UK, and what they have done is to really categorize all the people depending on what underlying chronic conditions they are. So you'll be there and you get a call. I mean, you don't even have to go out for it. You get a call that an appointment has been made for you to get the vaccine because we know you have diabetes. That's the way it ought to be because these people will be at risk of more severe disease and of dying from the disease. So if you have diabetes out there, and if your diabetes is not as well controlled as it should be, my concern for you is to take the vaccine as quickly as is possible. When your turn comes, please don't let the opportunity slip away because we do know that people with these conditions are at risk of dying from catching COVID.
Thank you. Thank you for actually speaking to those intersections, right? Because I was thinking just generally about the comorbidities, but it's so important to think about how we are even at greater risk because of all of these compounded factors. And, you know, personally, you know, my family and I had to make a decision. My father is in long-term care and, you know, he has diabetes and he's not able to make the decision for himself. And so, you know, had to sit down with my family and really think about when the vaccine was being offered, you know, what is the best approach? And so when I sat down with my family, I said, look, with my father and his different conditions, if he gets the COVID-19 virus, you know, we know what the outcome could be as far as serious illness, but also being in the hospital without family, which to us is just so painful a thought. compared to having the benefit of the vaccine. And, you know, of course, it's not a vaccine that existed for 20 years, but we know with the evidence, again, at this time, that it is the best defense against the COVID-19 infection. So we, you know, as a family sat down and said, you know, absolutely, yes, we want dad to have the vaccine. And I think that's really what it comes down to. It's like, we know the impact that this virus is having on the community, whether it's you know, higher rates of death, or it's just the complications that keep people away from work or in the hospitals alone. And so this is our best defense at this time. But, you know, Dr. Abdurrahman, I know there are other questions that people have about the value and the safety. So I'm going to come back to you now with a couple of questions, and then we'll close for break. And then we're going until 5 o'clock, but we'll close for break in a moment. So Dr. Abdurrahman, 2 questions I think you'll be able to answer. Some people are saying, what is the point in getting the vaccine if it's not going to protect against like infection completely, right? That it's not fully protecting against protection. And then if there are going to be adverse events like you described before, who's monitoring that? So maybe you can kind of enlighten us on those 2 questions.
Sure. So yes, the vaccines are not 100% protection from infection, but it will reduce your risk of getting symptomatic infection by 94 to 95%, depending on which of the 2 that we're discussing, Pfizer versus Moderna. So that is a huge reduction. And we're talking about this, you know, in terms of anyone, in terms of, like, we've talked about some of the social issues that we've kind of addressed in terms of sometimes there are some risk factors that place people at higher risk. So we're talking about reducing that, because we are overrepresented in those who get it and those who die from it. If you get COVID-19 in Canada, so 3 out of every 100 people who gets infected will die from it. That's kind of the risk of death from infection. But we know this is higher if you look at people who are Black. Also, if you get a severe case of it, your mortality risk or your risk of dying is 49%. So it goes up to like practically 50%. And so the other thing about the vaccines is it dramatically reduces your risk of having severe infection. So those, you know, 5 to 5.9% who could still get infection, they will have milder infection. They will not be in that category that would go on to like 50% chance of dying if they did get it, because they're not going to get severe forms of it. And as you know, Dr. Odame mentioned, you know, so when you look at if you start breaking it down as well by disease, if you have something like cardiovascular disease, your risk of dying from COVID goes up to 10%. If you have hypertension, it goes up to 6%. So 6 per 100 people who have hypertension. And unfortunately, we know that because of various issues, we are also overrepresented in these diseases. Similarly, in diabetes, 7.3% of chance of dying. So yes, it's not 100%, but it's going to bring down quite a lot. And if you did get it, it would only be a milder form. So your risk of dying would be much reduced. I know a lot of people are asking, what about like transmissibility? Like, could you still catch it and carry it? We're waiting for that data because the initial studies were really focused on, if you got it, can this protect you from disease? So focused on the person. They're now looking at it to see about transmissibility, to see if you're vaccinated, will this reduce the risk of you transmitting it? But even if it doesn't, one of the things I want you to know is when we talk about getting to that stage of herd immunity and having enough people, that's what happens with vaccines. For example, when you look at diphtheria and tetanus, we see very, very rare to see this. And if you're vaccinated, essentially practically unheard of. And that's because it really protects you. But diphtheria and tetanus are still very much present. If you are walking around barefoot and you get a nail in the foot, or get some of these soils into an open cut in your foot by standing in the soil, you'll still get exposed to these, but you're vaccinated. So yes, we don't know if we'll be able to reduce it from circulating, but we could reduce it infecting us and causing these terrible things. In terms of adverse events, with any vaccine in Canada, any approved vaccine in Canada, if there's any adverse events, we do have a monitoring system. You report it, you can personally even report it in Ontario. You can tell your local public health. You can tell if you see a doctor, see a nurse, anyone you tell, they also have an obligation and they will also report it. And this goes to the local public health units. We collect data Ontario-wide, and then there's Canada-wide. So yes, there is a system that is recording any adverse events, as well as following up with individual patients to find out what happened and to link them with specific follow-up if they require it. So there is a monitoring system. We are collecting all of this data. And we are constantly doing that, not just for the COVID-19 vaccines, but every single vaccine that is currently in our routine vaccination system, as well as travel vaccines. Any of the vaccines that are currently given and approved in Canada are followed in this system. So there is a structured system to follow that. So I assure you, these are going to be captured.
Right. And so, yes, these are systems that we already have. Like a question came in about, do those systems include race with regards to adverse events? So at this time, my understanding is that it does not, but those are things that we need to certainly continue to advocate for, not only the collection of race-based data, but that we're at the table when it comes to interpreting and sharing this information about us, right? So nothing about us without us as well. So we are at 4:01. This session goes until 5 o'clock. So we're going to take another break. And like yes, my name is Nigerian, I'm half Nigerian, but I'm also half Trini. And I'm missing Carnival, we all are. But in Carnival, we talk about last lap. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break and then we're gonna have a last lap of information and questions. So thank you again, and we'll be back at 4:10. Thank you. Okay, we're just getting ourselves back from intermission. Okay, there we go. All right. So welcome back everyone. We are in, like I mentioned, the last lap of answering questions that you folks have about the vaccine, about COVID-19, and the factors, the social factors, including systemic anti-Black racism that kind of put us in a vulnerable position. So we have been here with you since 2 o'clock, and this. Now we're in our last hour, but please do not worry. There will be other webinars and opportunities for us to have different, so there'll be different panelists, but for us to hear from you folks and answer different questions around different topics around COVID-19. Now, so I've been getting quite a few questions in the chat, and questions, I believe, from both the Zoom platform and the YouTube, not YouTube, but Facebook Live platform. One of the questions that keeps popping up, actually, and I wonder if Dr. Abdurrahman or Dr. Odame, if you'd want to address this, is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So in thinking about the rollout and the schedule, people are wondering, because the efficacy of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is more of a traditional vaccine, appears to be less than that of the 2 mRNA vaccines, which are in short supply. There's a question about if that's what's going to be given to Black people. I'm not sure where that rationale comes from. I don't know if it's because of Dr. Uche Blackstock. She's very well known and is working with Johnson & Johnson. I'm not sure, but there are quite a few questions about what are the implications if we get the less effective vaccine. So I don't know which one of you would prefer to take. All right, Dr. Abdurrahman, please.
I think we'll probably both, I'm sure Dr. Odame will have something to also add. What I was going to say is the way we're approaching the rollout is a phased rollout with attending to those who are at the highest risk first. So those who are at highest risk are receiving the mRNA vaccines. Later on, with some of the other vaccines, such as the Johnson & Johnson, there was a bit of a range in terms of efficacy. So when you were much older, you didn't have as much of a response. It was more effective in certain groups. So I think that perhaps when we get into those who are of less risk, then it might be considered. But I do think that they are going to hopefully consider the risk. And that's why we're addressing those very high risk earlier on. And hopefully the use of that vaccine will be more targeted to the groups where they'll have better response. We're waiting to find out, obviously, and we're going to be advocating to make sure that those at higher risk get those that are most effective. We're still waiting for the approval and then to find out from kind of the powers that be in terms of where they're hoping to put this, but that's, as it stands, we are phasing with highest risk first, and our phases are very much focused on the 2 most effective ones at this time.
Yes, if I may add to what my eminent colleague has said. Actually, come to look at these vaccines, we have been so spoiled by the 95% efficacy rate of the mRNA vaccines that it seems that other vaccines that are not close to that somehow are inferior. I want to sort of disabuse our minds that the only vaccine that has beaten the messenger RNA has been measles, 98%. No other vaccines that we give to our children have come any close to that. The whole aim of this is if we can prevent severe disease, that's first, that people don't die, that ultimately we'll be able to protect our hospitals from being overloaded, because it will be tragic if you need to be ventilated and you go to the hospital, they say, we don't have a ventilator. In fact, in Italy, the doctors tell you the most agonizing experience they had was, which one do we ventilate? Who do we choose? How do we decide who to put on a ventilator? We don't want to get to that extent. And that is why the vaccine, even if it was 60% efficient, that would be worth taking it. So in many ways, I think the way we should think is that whatever is available, let's take it. The Moderna vaccine, for example, can be stored at better, higher temperatures than the Pfizer. So it is right that they are taking it to the First Nations, those who are in very remote areas up north, where it's going to be long distances of travel so that you don't lose the effectiveness of the vaccine. So these are going to be technical details that the vaccine distribution task force will decide. But I plead with you that, I mean, the advantage of the Johnson & Johnson is that you have one shot. You don't need two shots. So you could say, well, if it is lower than 95% by it's one shot, it's a good deal, I think. So let us not pick and choose. I think that could be a problem because we need to vaccinate as many people as possible in the fastest possible time. And if you say you're going to pick and choose, then that may disrupt the whole process of implementation. I think all these vaccines, anything above 60% is good. And I think that is good enough to actually approve it.
Agree.
Thank
And just to
you.
add to that, sorry.
Yes, please, Dr. Abdurrahman.
Like we said, yes, it may be 60% to just decrease overall infection, but actually the decrease of severe COVID is much higher. Yes. So that is still maintained with these other vaccines. And that's what Dr. Odame was saying. We're trying to reduce the risk of dying and having severe consequences. So don't forget that part is much higher than that 60 to 80 range that they're giving you. The part of the protecting you from what, like the part that could kill you is much higher. So keep that in mind as well.
And thinking about like the implications of, severe disease, there's a question that came in and it says it was directed to Dr. Abdurrahman or Dr. Odame, but I'm going to bring it to you, Selena, about reasons to, people who are on the fence. And again, this is very real as far as the impact that it's had on our lives. And I know there have been surveys that, 1 in 10 Black people in Canada know somebody who had the COVID-19 vaccine. So what is your scientific advice, personal advice, however you want it, your advice for somebody who is on the fence on taking this vaccine?
So I'm going to be honest with that person that asked the question about being on the fence, because I have been on the fence and I've worked in clinical research for years. Because initially I had all of these questions around, well, I know it takes 12 years and $1 billion to bring a new drug entity to market. And what happened to those 12 years? And what happened to, like, why is it coming so quickly? And I go back to what we talked about right from the beginning, informed consent. So I really, and I also talk to my children. So we've been having these conversations about vaccinations for a very long time, where my children they have a different motivation. They will take the vaccine no matter what. And they think that I'm crazy, that I'm even hesitating about it. And they're thinking, you've worked in this for so long. Why are you hesitating, Mom? But to be honest, I was hesitant. And then I've been putting things in the chat, the videos that I watched, the studies that I've read that are not too convoluted. They're just very basic. That Tyler Perry video that I put in, where you had the Black woman explaining our mRNA. That was a great discussion that we had as a family. We watched it as a family. We discussed it together and shared it with my in-laws who are living in Florida. Of course, they're very concerned about COVID-19. They got their first vaccine 2 days ago. They got it this week, so they got their shots done this week. But really getting on the fence was for getting off that fence and onto the side where I said, okay, Akwatu Kenti, I will join this task force, is because I really did my research. I did my homework when it came to understanding, and then listening to this group of experts has been really eye-opening about even some of the things that I was sort of ignorant about in terms of what the vaccine could and could not do. Where's the mRNA going to go in my body? Like, where does it stay? To find out that it leaves and things like that, that it won't, go into my DNA. These are not ignorant questions that people have, is what I want to say at the end of it. These are not ignorant questions. These are fair questions that at least people have had the courage to say out loud. Because everybody's thinking it, but nobody's putting it out. So I think I really appreciate some of the conversations that's happening in the chat. But for me, getting off the fence was really related to getting the information that I needed from credible sources, not from WhatsApp most of the time, not from, something.com.not.com, but really credible sources. And I don't want to make light of that, because we're getting this information and we're not actually looking at where it's coming from. And we're reading through it like it's Bible, like it's truth. And it really isn't. And we need to sort of debunk that and try to get our information from credible sources and make that informed choice.
No, you know what, I appreciate you bringing it to first person, right? Like, not just the message you would tell somebody, but the message that you had to tell yourself, right? And thinking it through. And I think that's really key. Yes, we're being told, again, by mainstream society, we have to have it, but it's important to kind of block out the noise and then just get credible sources and make that decision. So, I can say for me, I also took a moment and I'm like, what's going on with the mRNA and reading and trying to understand more. Again, for those of us who understand the history, there is cause for pause. It does make sense to pause and say, this is very new. Let us take our time to understand it. And so I had to think to myself, especially as a public health physician, it's now known that in the Black communities, internationally, there is this hesitancy. So we're hearing, I could say as a physician, from mainstream colleagues, like, oh, how do we get more Black people vaccinated or whatever? And I'm like, you know what? I'm not actually focusing on what your concern is. I'm thinking about, okay, for the Black community, for myself, what makes sense as our best defense. And so when I think about how it is impacting ourselves, when I think about my family members are PSWs, like I have people who are frontline. My father is in long-term care. Then I want to be able, I have patients, I'm a provider. I want the vaccine. I haven't been able to get it yet because I work remotely. And so I'm still on the waiting list. But for me, it's very clear. I want to be able to, yes, protect myself. I want to be able to be part of that cocoon we're going to form around my dad when things open up and he's been in long-term care. I don't want to get COVID-19. I'm a mom. I'm a working mom, and I need to be able to be healthy and be there for my family. And then third, I know like all my other doctor colleagues always roll their eyes at me, but I also am a very social person. Maybe you get a sense that I'm a social person. I'm looking forward to when we can gather together socially again. AKA Carnival is on my mind. I am getting ready to book 2022. I don't care. Yes, this doctor likes to play mask for Carnival. And for us to be able to do those things, even if Carnival is not your thing, it could be church, whatever, for us to be able to gather safely and be able to have this new normal, then the vaccine is part of that, right? There's so many things that we talked about, social factors, and still wearing a mask now and protecting ourselves and better living conditions, better eating, all of those things, yes, is part of it. But the vaccine is part of that list of things that we need to strongly consider. And for me, I feel I need to do when I think about the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's, for me personally, but I think, Zainab and Dr. Sorry, I'm saying Zainab again, it's a habit because I speak to Zainab, Dr. Abdurrahman and Dr. Odame. We do know that many of our colleagues in healthcare who are frontline are so Black PSWs and nurses and other people have been offered the COVID-19 vaccine, but still wanted to take some time. But again, we've looked at the evidence. So do you have any messages for our fellow healthcare workers who are still on the fence?
I think what I would say to our fellow healthcare workers is there's now a lot of information out there, and we are speaking to this information and we're sharing it. And we are telling you this in the context of understanding where some of the distrust comes from based on the lived experiences and the history. And so we're providing this information to you hopefully so that you can make a decision. And I don't want you to make a decision because you feel obligated just because of your bosses or the supervisors. I want you to make this decision for you, for the way you stand in your family, to be able to provide for your family, for all the people you support, not just for who you support when you go to work, but also for your community. So really, that's why we're talking about this, because as much as we're talking about some of the social factors as well, we know we are also overrepresented when we're talking about PSWs, we're talking about people who have died in healthcare. A lot of them have been people who perhaps at the beginning also didn't have great access to PPE. So we recognize that earlier on in the pandemic, you were put in positions that were scary, that put you at higher risk of getting this disease. And so really want to encourage you to take control of the narrative. Make it that you're going to protect you and your family, and you're not going to potentially bring something home, and take it to consider how it's going to affect your life and protect you. So I hope that you're going to hear this information and hear it in the context that we have discussed, because we understand it. Other people aren't going to necessarily talk to you about some of this other aspects as to why you're concerned, and they may not even understand or have a context for it. But I hope that with us talking about it in the context that we understand why you are worried, I hope that you have the information to make the decision for yourself, because I don't want anybody else to be in these kind of situations where you're working as a PSW, working in long-term care, where you are at higher risk. And I hope that we have given you the information that you need in a safe space by other people who look like you.
Thank you. I think that's exactly it. We've seen the impacts, and we want to create these spaces where we can have these conversations and answer your questions to the best of our ability. Dr. Odame, unmuted, so I feel like you wanted to. Yeah.
Yes. So on Thursday, I'll be getting my second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. So just to let you know, I decided very early that I'm going to take the vaccine. For healthcare workers, we work with people. This virus is powerful, but it only thrives when people contact each other. And that's why lockdowns are very effective in bringing the infection rates down. It needs people. We work with people. We are in the profession because we love people. We love to see patients and families. We love to have contact. For us to be able to continue to do that, whether you're a PSW, whether you're a care provider, whether you're a janitor in a hospital, in the healthcare system, that is the love of our hearts. That's why we do it. We enjoy doing that work. But that puts us at risk. And when we are infected, we can put others at risk as well. So it is that concern that makes me want to get the vaccine early so that I can protect myself, I can protect my patients. I see a lot of children and they come with their families. So if I infect the children and their parents, I'm infecting a whole family. And it is this weight on me that makes me want to protect myself. And many of us health workers are taking the opportunity to get vaccinated. Should we weigh the risks and the benefit? By all means. Should we think about the science or whether the data is reliable? By all means. Should we look at whether enough information has been found about the side effects? By all means. As we said, nearly 90 million people around the world have already received the vaccine. The tragedy is that we worry about millions and millions of people in Africa and poor countries who may not have access. So if we have access in Canada, please, let's take the opportunity, because this pandemic is unprecedented. I've heard people say it is like the flu. It is not. It's 10 times more likely to kill you than the flu. And we never in the flu season ever saw our ICUs being overloaded. Toronto came very close to that. And that's why the lockdown was enforced. So health workers are getting vaccinated because we weighed the benefits against the risks. Better to have the side effects than to have the natural infection, which could be catastrophic depending on your situation. So if you get the vaccine, you are in good company because a lot of health workers have decided to take the vaccine. It may come to the point where if you are a frontline worker and you are not vaccinated, there may be some concern that you could be putting others at risk. And this is about society. It's about our responsibility to one another. And therefore, even if you are not so concerned for yourself, what about your dad, your mom? What about your cousin? What about others that you come into contact with? So let's do this together as a society because we cherish our loved ones and we want to be there for them in this time when our lives have been disrupted. And aren't you getting tired of it? Let's get our lives back. It's so depressing. We're so isolated. We need to get to see our people, go to Trinidad for the carnival. All this is lost on us. And I think we need to get our lives back. And that's why I've taken the vaccine. And if you ask me, I recommend that strongly. But it's your personal decision. And I'm hopeful that through this chat, you'll feel at least more comfortable to actually make that decision. Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you.
Odame, bringing the real.
Yes.
Aren't you just done? Aren't you tired?
We are tired, and it seems like I am giving everybody dreams of carnival. That's my coping mechanism, but there will be a session on mental health. But in the meantime, yes, I dream of carnival. Now, we do have, a few other questions that are important to address. But I think that's, you hit the nail on the head. We're tired of being in this situation and all these lockdowns. And personally, again, for me as a mom, helping with Zoom kindergarten was not fun. And so, yes, Selena, Zoom kindergarten, right? Like, listen with a 5-year-old. Like, we do want to get back to our lives. And again, the vaccine is our best defense to be able to do that. Now, there are other questions, and we're going to come back a little bit to some of the questions around mistrust. There have been, and so actually, I'll do one for Zainab, which is around the issue of multiple vaccines. So I'll come to you in a second about that question, because people are asking about different types of vaccines and what the evidence is around that. But Dr. Odame, or whoever might know, that there were questions about specifically South Africa and thoughts on vaccines or efforts to sterilize the Black community. But Dr. Odame, I'll come to you in a moment. I'll just go to Dr. Abdurrahman to speak about the different combinations of vaccines, and then we'll circle back to that question about South Africa.
So what exactly is the specific question? Maybe I missed that one.
So yeah, that one was a little bit earlier about if you take, for instance, Moderna and then decide to take Johnson & Johnson, or if you take Johnson & Johnson and then later, yeah. So.
Okay, so at this time, there haven't been any studies looking at mixing and matching of the vaccines. So at this point, we are recommending that you complete the series of the one type of vaccine. So if you do Pfizer, or do Moderna, or if you are going to do the other ones, the combination of just those ones. So, Johnson & Johnson is the one, then there's the AstraZeneca, which is also 2 doses, but staying within the same one, because it has not been studied. And so if you want to get what we are kind of talking about in terms of how effective these vaccines are, we do recommend using them as they are prescribed, because then you know what you're getting. I can't comment on these combinations because they haven't been studied. So the goal will be to give you the full vaccination based on the brand you get. So, when we talk about having doses for people, they're, for the ones that require 2, they're getting 2 doses per person. So, when they say we have enough for, let's say, 10 patients, they mean they have 20 doses because they're considering it as getting the full thing there. In the future, will we maybe find out later about some of these combinations that may happen or may be formally studied? Potentially. And then at that point, I'm able to give you a research response based on data versus just kind of hypothetical. So that's what I would recommend at this time.
Thank you. And so that's, you know, the information that we have. Everything is still so new. And so so now kind of coming back again, in every break, we've kind of come back to issues around addressing anti-Black racism and issues where, or historical or present day contexts where we have been the target. And so Dr. Odame, I'm actually going to combine two questions, because one was about South Africa, and if there had been decisions or efforts to sterilize Black men at the time of Truth and Reconciliation. And there are also questions about the variants being kind of like are the variants happening randomly, or are they being created somehow to cause harm to groups, and I suppose specifically Black people?
So I'll tackle the second question first. So viruses mutate. That's how they survive. They are smart animals. They want to live, they multiply, and they change themselves. In fact, we are even fortunate that we haven't seen as many variants as could have been happening as we are seeing. So, and the way to stop them mutating is to try to stop transmission of the virus, because as it multiplies, it goes through various multiplication. And you can think of repeating certain steps many, many times. The chance of one error happening in the whole process is higher the many more times you repeat the same thing. So viruses mutate. And I think it's a bad idea that we name these mutations after countries. We learned that from the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu had nothing to do with Spain, but that Spanish flu got stuck, and it gave Spain a bad name. And I worry that we call it the South African variant, the Brazil variant, the UK variant. For all you know, the UK variant was already in the US before the UK discovered it. So they discovered it, or somebody came from South Africa and had it, and we put that name on it. I'm worried that it may give Africa, now we have the Nigerian variant, it may give Africa a bad name, but this is what the virus does. And if you look for it enough, you realize that some of these variants are already occurring even here in Canada without our knowing. So I just want to say, so far, there are only few of them that is causing a sort of concern that the vaccine will not cover. The hopeful thing I've seen is that the mRNA vaccines can be easily sort of adapted to cover the variants that are circulating. And my prediction is that actually after this COVID pandemic is done, it may be something that we have to, just like the flu, that every now and then we need to know which strain is circulating and develop a vaccine for it. So let us not think that this pandemic will be over and will be forgotten. I think we may have to deal with it, and these variations will occur, but hopefully scientists will be able to determine which variants are more troubling and be able to develop specific vaccines for it. I hope it's longer than a year. It's more than maybe 2 to 3 years, but nobody can tell at this point. So let's not be too alarmed about the variants. It's causing a lot of anxiety. That's what viruses do. Let's get protected against the virus with the vaccines we have. And if subsequently new variants emerge and need new vaccines, I think we'll hope that that will be possible. Then back to the issue of sterilization. The issue of sterilization of Africans has been an age-old problem. And we think that because there's a lot of racism against Blacks, the notion is that the rest of the world wants to depopulate Africa. In fact, it originated from tetanus vaccines that were developed for pregnant women, no, not pregnant women, but women of reproductive age. So they wanted to prevent tetanus in babies. Tetanus in babies is deadly. It's a deadly thing. We haven't seen it in Canada for a long, long time. But if a baby gets tetanus, we still see it in Africa, it's deadly. So the public health officials thought that the best way to prevent tetanus in babies is to immunize women of reproductive age. Okay? So if you're with me, so because they are more likely to have babies, so why not focus on them? But this was misread as, oh boy, you want to sterilize them. You put something in the vaccine as a permanent contraception to prevent them from having babies. And since then, there has been this kind of theory that when mass vaccinations are done in Africa, somehow there's this hidden sort of agenda to sterilize them. It happened in northern Nigeria with polio vaccines, and we saw polio, which had almost completely been eradicated. We saw polio coming back in Nigeria. So up to today, Nigeria remains one of only 2 countries that still have polio when the rest of the world has eradicated polio. So a lot of these things circulate. And of course, we do know that there's a history in the United States where women were sterilized because they didn't think that they were capable of looking after children. And they were sterilized against their own. They used surgical procedures to sterilize them. So all these things feed into the theory that there's an attempt to depopulate. But let me make one statement. The population of many parts of the richer countries is falling, is dwindling. It's not rising. And actually, if I were in their shoes and trying to control events in the world, where will I sell my goods? Where will I sell all the things that I'm making in the world if my goal is depopulate the world? It doesn't make sense. I mean, Africans are dependent on goods that are produced here in Canada and US and Europe. And without us, those economies will not be as strong as they are. So it doesn't make sense to me that they would depopulate in that way. But this is circulating a lot, and it's becoming a major avenue of mistrust that in this vaccine, there's the plan to depopulate Africans and to depopulate people living in South Africa and other places. There was a plan to sort of suppress South African men and to keep them where they were in the apartheid system. And we do know that. And the way they did it was to incarcerate them, deny them education, and by so doing, really lower their ability to influence society. But I don't think there's good evidence for that theory at all. What they did was to deny them education, deny them access to jobs, access to opportunities that will make us rise. And I have to say, education is the key. If you deny people education, is the easiest way to keep them down and to ensure that you can influence them in a permanent way. And that's what the apartheid system was about.
Thank you for that, Dr. Odame. And I think, so a couple of points that I want to raise. So one is, it is important for us, because I'm seeing some comments in the chat, it is important for us to debunk some of the myths. And the myths are actually drawn from historical experiences. So sterilization has been used in Black and Indigenous populations in North America. And so where this truth and fact and fiction gets mixed, we as Black physicians, that's why this is a safe space, we're addressing some of these issues. Now, not all issues, I agree, were addressed today. So we're doing some of the scientific questions, and we're also debunking some of the myths that are circulating and preventing people from getting the vaccine. But the good thing is we do have your questions, and there's going to be more sessions. So I know that we weren't able to address everybody's questions, but we are going to continue to address both myths and some of the other facts. Now, I know that we're at 4:44 and Dr. Kwatu Kenti has now turned on his camera, but I do want to kind of give just a moment, Kwatu, if any of our panelists have anything else that they want to add as closing remarks before we have you please take us to, as I mentioned, last lap. So let's go with Selena, then Dr. Isaac, then Dr. Abdurrahman. Very briefly, if you have any message that you want our communities to hear.
So I don't really have a message, but I do want to talk to the question about homelessness. Somebody asked about, people that don't have access. And one of the people that I have been following quite closely is Angela Cook. She's a Black woman who's the VP or Vice President at BC Housing. And the strategy that she has employed for individuals in BC who are homeless around COVID starts with empathy and dignity. And I think it's really important to talk about that when we're talking about this conversation around consent and around how we distrust and how we treat people. Angela, I was going to call her doctor, but she's not a doctor. Angela Cook said that her philosophy around homelessness in BC started with dignity and empathy, and has created homeless pods or shelters for individuals, have hot meals, not just little catered boxes of stuff, but hot meals delivered, cell phones that individuals who are homeless have, that they're able to get information right to them. And that reduces the opportunity for them to have to leave and go to other places, have to leave to go find food. And they've taken a really humanitarian approach to how they're dealing with their homeless population. I haven't been really following the Toronto one, but I know that there are examples here in Canada. And again,
that we can follow.
Thank
you. Yeah, I think thinking about models in other areas within Canada and outside of Canada are key. Dr. Isaac, is there anything else that you want to add before we conclude?
All I want to say is that these vaccines have been tested among enough Blacks for us to know that it works and is safe among Blacks. Blacks in South Africa have participated. Nearly 10% of the Moderna and Pfizer study included Blacks. So we can confidently say that it works in Blacks, and Blacks have been studied in it. And by that fact alone, we have a right to derive benefit from this vaccine. And so the facts are clear, and I want to say that I think it's enough for us to be confident that it can work in Blacks as well, and it is safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Odame. Dr. Abdurrahman?
Dr. Odame stole my thunder. But what I just really did want to emphasize, I know there were multiple times it came up in the chat, are these vaccines good for Black people? Is this the right dose for Black people? Up to nearly 10% were in the studies. They also, in the studies, they looked at the response based on race, based on age. They did look at that, and there was no significant difference because people were Black or subscribed to being Latinx populations. There was no difference in the response based on race. And this kind of goes back to the thing that genetically we're still the same, and race is a social construct, and it's actually all these other social factors that play a huge issues in terms of race. So biologically, immunologically, this works for us, and we should take the advantage to change the narrative of how our Black community survives this pandemic. And I just want to say thank you for coming, and thank you for your interest, and that we're going to have more of these. And I know there's some people who wanted to get into a lot of like nitty gritty about the vaccine, and our next session is going to be more focused on specifics about the science behind the vaccine as well. So there's more opportunities, and there'll be a multitude of these sessions, as well as other groups who are going to have it focused on the Black community. So keep reaching out, keep focusing, hearing about it, keep yourself informed so you can make the right decision for you and take the time to make that decision. Thank you, and thanks for listening today.
Thank you, Dr. Abdurrahman. And so that's exactly it. Take the time to think about this. I know there were questions about what best you can do, but when it comes biologically, the protection, yes, vaccine is part of it. Washing your hands, wearing the mask, all of the things that we need to do as human beings biologically work for us. But then there's the social factors. And so this task force, all these conversations are talking about COVID-19, the vaccine, and beyond, because there are so many factors involved in what made us vulnerable. So I also thank you for tuning in. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Kenty to wrap things up. Thank you so much.
Myself, and thank you very much, Dr. Onye. Just a few key points that I wanted to follow up very briefly on being vaccinated. I'm vaccinated. And the reason I'm vaccinated, I took the Pfizer vaccine, is because I'm a caregiver for my dad who has dementia and is in a home. And my mom, who is 80, and she will not survive COVID because of the underlying conditions she has. Yeah, so I took the vaccine primarily to protect them, but it will, of course, protect myself. And so I walk the talk on vaccines when we're talking about vaccines, walk the talk. Just in terms of closing remarks, I want to thank the audience for hanging in with us, because I see that the majority of you stuck in, and 3 hours on Zoom is murder. I mean, even if it's last lap, and last lap is the best part of Carnival, by the way. Some people love Juve, me, last lap. So thank you, the audience. I want each audience member to take the information for themselves, weigh it for themselves, validate, verify for yourself. Don't take it as a gift that we're giving you. We're sharing evidence that we think is relevant to your decisions, but the decision is yours. And even so, validate it for yourself, verify it for yourself. That's the best way to go. Excellence speaks for itself. So I don't have to big up the panelists that much, but I would tell you that I have watched many town hall meetings in the past few weeks, and this is the best. This is the best. Outstanding dialogue and conversation. I know we're limited by Zoom technology, so that the interaction that you would have if you were in an auditorium is not there. And we'll get to that eventually, hopefully, when this phase is over. I want to invite the audience members, once you've done your homework, to share your experiences and insights with the City of Toronto through toronto.ca COVID-19. You could share it with us through our website that just went live this afternoon, torontoblackcovid.ca. Once you have made your decision, or once you feel it's comfortable, please share the info with family, friends, colleagues, peers. Yes, I've gotten requests about whether we can extend ourselves to homes and staffing groups, and we are trying to do it that way. We would love to take a barbershop approach. Go to the barbershop, dialogue with people in the barbershop. That's where some of the richest conversations in our community take place. And to the maximum extent possible, we will make that effort. There's one important thing about our panel and about our conversations. There's no empathy gap. You don't have to worry about empathy gap. Do they understand? Do they feel this pain? Do they appreciate that when you go to a doctor or a nurse and tell them, this is what I get, this is what I'm feeling, and they discount you, they tell you, no, that's not what you're feeling. They don't even look you in the eye. Yes, we understand that very well, and we have factored that into our discussion, our decision-making. I apologize for my phone in the background. All Black lives are invaluable and indispensable. That's an assumption that we are working with, and we want you to take that when you walk away and judge the information. There is no empathy gap. I don't care if you're in prison. I don't care if you're in a home. I don't care if you're in a psychiatric institution. Your life is equally valuable. We want to protect your life, save your life. You are of incredible value for your family. My dad is at home. He has dementia. I love him just the same. I need him just the same. I know all of you probably feel the same way, but I gotta tell you, that privilege is magnified when you have people depending on you. A lot of the caregivers who are in the hospitals are lone income earners, single income earners. There are a lot of women whose whole family is in, not just in lockdown, they're in financial lockdown because she's not earning the income, she's in the hospital. Think about that, weigh your decision, weigh the life of your family, make the right decision for them and for yourself. But no, we're not here. You don't have to worry. No empathy gap, no interest gap. Whatever happens with the Black communities of Toronto will happen with us. That's what we know. That's why we have a vested interest in seeing our community move out of this in a positive way. Learn from this, and when we recover, make sure that we're not in the same place that we were in when we got into it. So thank you very much. Please fill out the survey on your way out. Attend future town halls. We don't want to town hall you to death. Want of a better word, you know, I'm a Trinity too, so Onye has half the excellence of that background, but no worries, no worries. Love, enough respect. Thank you so much. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Spread the word. Stay safe. Thank you very much.